application already on Celo today, you maybe feel like, oh, like liquidity as well, right? Like I think you oftentimes, a lot of projects we talk to realize kind of this tension of like, hey, Celo is like the most aligned community that I have, that we think like a lot of usage will come from, but we just know for the fact of matter is that like most liquidity exists on Ethereum. And so what then oftentimes happens is that everyone's like, oh, why don't we just deploy on Celo and on Ethereum? And the problem with that is that, let's say if you have like a DEX, like, like Uniswap that just deployed on Celo, like when you use Uniswap on Celo, you don't actually get to access the like gigantic liquidity that exists on Uniswap on Ethereum. And so really like Uniswap on Celo is a completely separate app from Uniswap on Ethereum. They just happen to like share the same branding and like I guess in the V3 case, really impressive technology. But the state, which is really the like interesting part about the blockchain, is not shared at all between these different Uniswap deployments. And so the question that we asked ourselves was, what if you didn't have to be constrained by that particular technological, I guess, problem? And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to enable basically these interchain applications, which are similar, I guess, to what we call these fragmented applications. They're deployed on every chain, but Abacus allows all of these contracts to talk to each other so that it feels like a single application, like actually. And so like the future world would be where like if you use Uniswap on Celo, it's exactly the same as Uniswap on Ethereum. You get to access exactly the same liquidity. And so in that sense, Abacus is kind of like what we call the connective tissue between the state of your application that lives on all of these different blockchains. And if you really squint very hard enough, it's a smart router for block space where, right, like the Ethereum block space is like this like very secure, like, you know, very expensive block space that like if you have state that needs to be super secure, you want to use that block space. But then maybe for like small trades where like you don't need that high level of security, you might want to access cheaper, more accessible block space like Celo or like what many people do with Polygon. And so Abacus basically allows you to pick whatever block space you need for your particular application, not only for your application, but for your specific use case within your application. Next slide. Oops. And so if you think about the world that we have today, effectively, is that interoperability, right, like happens at the user level, right? Like if you have an application today, you basically make your user come to you, right? Like if you have like an application on Celo and like you talk to a user that has like funds in Ethereum, you basically tell the user, hey, go do this work by like finding a relevant bridge your assets from Ethereum over to Celo, and then you can access our application. And that ultimately seems like a pretty bad user experience, right? Like you really want to meet the user where they're at. And so that's what we kind of call moving interoperability into the app instead of at the user level, right? Like this should really be, as developers of applications, you really should focus on providing the best user experience possible. And I think for us, that means that you should be in charge of interoperability. Like you should abstract that away from the user and not make the user think about that. And so once you do that, I think there's a bunch of like interesting app use cases that one can think of. And like, you know, we're in the business of helping developers figure these things out. But you know, some ideas that you could put out there are like natively interchain assets, for example. Like I think today, the bridge world that we live in really means that there's like, you know, I think on Celo there's like what, 4 or 5 bridges already. And so when you bridge ETH over from Ethereum to Celo, like you end up with 5 different wrapped ETH versions on Celo, right? And instead, what if there's like a canonical, like the asset issuer has a canonical asset version on Celo. And so that way you kind of avoid this like liquidity fragmentation. And so, you know, conversations with like issuers like Circle, where I think on Solana there's like 17 different like wrapped USDC representations, would kind of like be a thing of the past. Another thing that you can do is that I think we've seen a lot of interest on is a lot of collateral lives on Ethereum, right? But like no one wants to trade against that collateral on Ethereum because it's so expensive. But again, today you basically make users transfer that collateral over a bridge to, let's say, Polygon or Celo so that they can trade against that collateral. But like you could build an application that just kind of like transmit information of what collateral lives on Ethereum and then like trade against that on, let's say, Celo or Polygon. Another thing that you can do is what we call a control panel. Actually, we already have an application out there that developers could just take off the shelf and deploy. But it basically allows an address on one chain to like issue transactions or just like generally own things on another chain. So that, again, like if you want to like do activity on another chain as a user, you don't have to like move over. You don't have to move like both native token assets as well as just like generally issue transactions on another chain. Like a DAO could just like live on, again, Celo or Ethereum, but like own assets and do things on another chain. And then the last example I want to mention here are Interchain NFTs, right? So we see, again, today, like, I guess today, where like the price of ETH is down over the last couple of months, like maybe minting and trading NFTs becomes much cheaper on Ethereum again, but like I think beforehand, I think just the cost of minting NFTs on Ethereum was so prohibitive, and I think that ultimately restrains, again, your user set of like who can actually access your applications. And so what if you could basically like write like mint on every chain, transfer to different chains, and again, access block space at the right trade-off level that you're interested in, while still having the option, right, of like, again, effectively returning to Ethereum if you need kind of that level of security, or like you want to have kind of that canonical notion of where the NFT should live. So I talked a little bit about how, the future that we want to enable, but how does it work? Ultimately, it's a pretty hard problem. If you think about it, it's an instantiation of the Oracle problem with like a slightly bigger constraint, in that like the source of the information just happens to be another blockchain. And so the way we did it is that we have implemented solely in smart contracts. So we have basically these mailbox contracts that live on each chain. When a smart contract on chain A wants to send a message, they basically just call a function on the outbox, which enqueues the message on that outbox. Validators who basically are elected on that source chain effectively assert the root of a Merkle tree where those messages are enqueued in, and those assertions can basically be validated on the inbox on the receiving chain. And so what you end up with that system is, it's pretty simple in the grand scheme of things, but ultimately what you end up with is a replicated Merkle tree on the destination chain, and then you can have the inbox call your receiving contract on the receiving chain. And of course, I'm like glossing over a lot of details. If you're interested in learning more, I'll be having office hours, I think, on the mezzanine right after this and tomorrow. What's ahead? So we just launched on mainnet about 2 weeks ago. We still, have some like testing we're doing, but messages are being processed pretty reliably at this point, and so we're looking forward to working with more developers to ultimately deploy their projects on mainnet. I think the kind of, big picture is that, again, like block space, there will be many different execution environments going forward, right? Like I think there's a lot of hype about Celestia, there's a lot of rollups coming up. And so we think this, like the world that we live in today, where there's a lot of chains, this will only quote unquote get worse, right? Where people have to think about like, oh my God, which chain do I choose? And I think that just will actually mean for developers that like block space will be available to all kinds of different trade-offs. And again, like I think maybe similar to the Cosmos vision where like everyone does their own app chain, like we do think that people will want to pick their own trade-offs, their own validator sets there. And I think with Abacus, you have the ability to basically do that for like very heterogeneous block space versus, right, like with IBC, you're constrained to Cosmos, or like to Tendermint chains. With Polkadot, constrained to a substrate. So yeah, so we think that's, we're biased, but like we think this is the future of interoperability for our industry. And so if you are interested, if you have questions, come find me. If you won't be able to, check out our docs.